this video I want to give a brief introduction to work centers, which are a type of master data that is important for production planning in SAP. And this video is part of a series where I try to give a basic introduction to production planning in SAP, such that you can understand the basic and the fundamental principles used by SAP for allowing for production planning. You can also find the content of these slides on my blog, and in the video description you can find a link that will take you to the respective blog posts. A work center can be a machine, a tool, a device, a person, or it can be a group of these things. Essentially what a work center is, it's a spatial area within the work system, for example the factory of your company or enterprise. And it represents an area where some operations are executed. And you can use a work center to also define which persons or machines are involved in an operation and what kind of operations can run on your work center. This is done together with routings and capacities, and I will touch on routings in a later on video. But it's important to understand that this is essentially what we try to do with work centers. We try to model the workstations in our working system. Therefore, you can also use work centers for modeling costs. You can assign a work center to a cost center, and you can thereby use this work center model to trace the costs that are incurred during your operations. You can also use a work center to schedule and manage your capacities, as you can specify the available capacity through a work center. You can specify the scheduling structures, and essentially you can use work centers for scheduling and managing capacities. When you create a work center or maintain a work center, it's always plant specific. So you create a work center in combination of an assignment to a specific plant. So a given work center exists within a specific plant. When you create a work center, you can use transaction code CR01. And when you want to maintain an existing work center, you can use transaction code CR02. When you then enter a work center, you will find that it has various views. It has the basic data view, the default values view, the capacities view, the scheduling view, and the costing view. Here's a very basic overview of what you can specify and see and display in the various views of a work center, and we will touch on the important areas later on in this video. In the basic data view, you can assign responsibilities and you can assign plan relations. And then you can also assign a standard value key in the basic data view. The standard value key is important for scheduling and capacity planning, and I will touch on that later. But basically what a standard value key does, it's mapping certain parameters to your work center, since a standard value key is nothing but a key that defines a set of parameters. So when you add a standard value key to a work center, you are thereby assigning certain parameters to the work center, and those parameters are used by formulas for scheduling and capacity requirements calculation. Therefore, the standard value key is important, as it provides the parameters that are available for those calculations. In the default values view, you can specify certain default values for routing. As I said, I'm going to touch on routing in a later on video. In the capacity views, you can specify or display formulas for capacity requirements calculation. You can adjust capacity headers that represent services available to your work center for conducting operations. Also, this is something I'm going to touch on in one of the upcoming slides. The scheduling view, you can control or set certain parameters that affect the formula for scheduling tasks. And in the costing view, you can assign the work center to a cost center, such that you can trace costs to certain cost centers. This is basically a accounting related view. There are various categories of work centers, and you can maintain categories for work centers using transaction code OP40. The reason for specifying different work center categories is that it allows you to control work center usability in routings. Some work center categories can be used in certain routing plan types only. And some examples of work center categories would be machine group, labor group, plant maintenance, and there are also other types of work center categories available. You can also create additional work center categories. Another thing that's important to notice is when working with work centers, you can specify a task list usage. Task list usage is something that you should be interested in if you want to have additional control over work center usability in routings. So the task list usage allows you to specify which type of task types and task list types your work center could be used for. This is something that is used for in routings. For example, you can set the task list usage to only routings or only rate routings, or there are other choices that you can select from. This is also something that we will have a closer look at in one of the upcoming videos where I'm going to touch on routings. And now we have come to the point where I want to talk a little bit about capacities and the capacity view. It's important to understand the concept behind capacity. A capacity object represents a service that is provided by, for example, a machine or personnel. And capacities are objects that can be maintained through the work center's capacity view. You can also create capacity objects with a separate transaction code, and I'm going to show you this in an upcoming slide. But this is important to understand that a capacity is not the same as a work center. It is a object on its own, and it can be maintained through the capacity view of a work center, but a capacity is not the same as a work center. And one example for that would be pooled capacities, which I will be discussing in a bit, but essentially you could have, for example, capacities that are used not just by this specific work center, but by various work centers. And this would be an example of a capacity not being equal or equivalent to a certain work center. And also another thing to notice is a work center can have multiple capacities. For example, it could have machine capacities, it could have personnel capacities, or you can specify other capacities such as spare capacities for rush orders. As I said, capacities can be maintained through the capacity view of the work center. I also mentioned that work centers can have multiple capacities. And when you want to add an additional capacity to a work center, you do this by adding a capacity category. These capacity categories, you can also create them yourself and you can maintain them. If you want to create them, you can follow the path that I listed here. You assign capacity categories to the capacity view when creating a work center. And if you want to add a capacity category to a work center that you already created, then you do this. Then this is also done in the capacity view. In the capacity view, you can open a capacity and this will display work center capacity header. So this is the the header of representing the capacity. In this header, you can, for example, specify capacity planner group, factory calendar ID. The factory calendar ID, there are some default IDs. For example, there's the German factory calendar, which is documented as a standard calendar type in SAP. In the capacity header, you can also specify the base unit of measure. For example, if you want to display data with base unit set to 2 hours. You can also specify here daily work start and finish time, as well as the length of daily breaks. And then you can also specify capacity utilization rate and number of individual capacities. The capacity utilization rate, if you, for example, set it to 100%, then this would mean that you tell SAP, or you're documenting in your system, that you assume that the work time, meaning the time being available, except from breaks. So if you subtract the breaks from the time available between finish time and work start time, then if you set the capacity utilization rate to 100%, your assumption is that you can use all of this time to fulfill your production orders, and all of this time will be available and you can use it in a productive manner. In reality, this will almost never be the case. Therefore, you should specify a capacity utilization rate that is below 100%. For example, if you set the capacity utilization rate to 95%, your assumption would be that there's some loss in productive time equal to 5% of the time available between work finish time and work start time, subtracted the breaks. Number of individual capacities means that if you, for example, have a workstation or a work area where you have, let's say, 3 workstations, so 3 workstations, 3 people working there, 3 machines, that means you have basically 3 individual capacities. You have not only one machine, you have 3 machines, and all of these machines can be executing your task. And the last thing in the capacity header, what you can specify is the relevance for finite scheduling, or overload percentages, relevance for long-term planning, and whether it can be used for several operations. This is maybe something I would not want to go into detail with in this video. I will be touching on that in some of the upcoming examples that I'm going to be showing to you in the SAP environment. Just some quick information on shift sequences. So in SAP PP, you can also specify shifts and break plans and shift sequences using transaction code OP4A. Basically, you will start with a table and specify all your breaks. For each break, you'll be writing the start time, end time, and the length of the break. Then you can create shifts, which you also create in the table that contains in the column the start time, the finish time, and then the breaks. The breaks that you can be assigning here, basically those that you created in the break plan. And then you can, in a final matrix, on a weekday basis, you can assign shifts that then also, through this workflow, contain the information on the break plan. So you can assign in the shift sequence the shifts to workdays, and thereby you have eventually specified shift sequences. Those shift sequences, together with the shifts and the break plans, are assigned to groupings, and those groupings can be assigned to a work center in the capacity header, and thereby you have assigned a certain shift calendar, shift plan to this work center's capacity header. To get back to one of the topics I discussed a little bit on one of the earlier slides, is the topic of pooled capacities. This would be an example where you have, let's say, a working area, you have 2 workstations, but you only have one piece of equipment that represents a capacity. This piece of equipment is available throughout your working time, so let's say it is available 8 hours per day. However, it can only be used by one workstation. In this case, this piece of equipment is representing a capacity, since it is a service that is available for capacities to be able to that is available for work centers to be able to conduct certain operations. And it is a pooled capacity, since it is used by not only one work center but by multiple work centers, and it cannot be used by various work centers at the same time. This would be an example where you have to create a capacity object in a separate transaction, and that transaction code would be CR11. Here you can create capacity objects, and there's a checkbox called pooled capacity. If you check that one, then SAP knows that you're modeling a pooled capacity. Once you create the pooled capacity, you can then assign it to a work center in the capacity view. In the capacity view of a work center, you can display pooled capacities, but you can not directly maintain them through the capacity view of the work center. This also makes sense, since you want to make sure that a pool capacity is not by accident adjusted from one work center only, as it will have direct impact on other work centers. The last main area that I want to touch on are the formulas for capacity requirement and scheduling, and formulas in general. So for example, operation time and capacity requirement are calculated by formulas. You can customize formulas using a transaction, which is transaction OP21. But what is important to understand is that formulas use parameters, and they use certain values. And in order for formulas to be able to work with those parameters must be created, and they must be assigned to standard value keys. There's a transaction for creating parameters, which is OPCX. You can also use transaction OP7B, and then you can assign parameters to standard value keys using transaction code OPCM. So basically what a standard value key is, it's a set of parameters, and you can assign the standard value key to a work center. Then the work center knows, okay, those are the parameters that I can use in my formulas for capacity requirement and for operation time calculation. This is also what I'm trying to point out on this slide. A standard value key specifies which parameters can be considered by a formula. And for example, a standard value key could comprise parameters such as setup time, machine time, labor time. Those would basically be the parameters that you need in most companies. The standard value key can then be mapped to the work center by entering a key. That would be the standard value key, and you enter the standard value key in the general data section of the work center. Now the work center knows, okay, this is the standard value key that was assigned to me. Those are the parameters that I can use in my formulas. This doesn't mean that the formulas can only use those parameters for conducting the calculation. In addition to that, formulas can use parameters that are taken from an order that is running on the work center. For example, base quantity, operation quantity, number of operation splits. This is information that can be pulled from the order itself. However, also in this case, someone has to create the parameters in SAP. Usually this is done by the IT department. This is not something production planner is usually doing. But to understand the fundamentals, someone will first have to create those parameters before being able to use them in formulas. Then it's also important to understand that you can create formulas yourself using transaction OP21. And when you create a formula, you can specify whether this formula is applicable to scheduling or whether it's applicable to deriving capacity requirements. But for those two purposes, there are also two standard formulas available in SAP, which would be SAP 006, which is a standard SAP formula for capacity requirement. And then there is SAP 002, which is a standard SAP formula for calculating processing time. The formulas are listed here on the bottom of the slide. So you have capacity requirement. Capacity requirement is calculated by, and I made an error here, it should not say standard value key, it should just say standard value. So it's standard value times order quantity divided by base quantity. So if your order quantity is 1, your base quantity is 1, your standard value is 1 minute, then the capacity requirement would be 1 minute. Duration is calculated by standard value times order quantity divided by base quantity divided by the number of splits. So here it's important to note that this parameter number of splits has quite some impact on the duration of your operations. However, as you can see, the number of splits does not impact the capacity requirement itself. It is a parameter that does not turn up in the capacity requirement calculation. Then there's the scheduling view of a work center, and here it's important that to note that you can specify the scheduling basis. The scheduling basis is something. In the scheduling basis, you can specify a certain capacity category that is used as the basis for scheduling. So if you think of your work center, as I said, there can be various capacities available on this work center, and they can be different working times. In order for SAP to know which of those capacities should be used for scheduling, it is important to specify the scheduling basis. In that case, SAP will know, okay, this is the capacity that I use for scheduling. So this was my basic introduction to work centers in SAP. In a upcoming video, I'm going to give a basic introduction to routings in SAP, and then afterwards I will be moving on to showing some examples in the SAP environment. So show some more practical examples to give you an understanding how this is done in SAP.